Mathias Larsen is from the digital design agency here in Copenhagen called 1508, and they contacted us because they heard we were doing a conference on degrowth, and they said, well, degrowth is one of our core values, so it was an obvious choice to collaborate with 1508, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you. Here to talk about Dare to Degrowth, Mathias Larsen. Welcome to stage.
Thank you
I think
so
you've
much.
got your...
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for buying a ticket to a conference with the topic of degrowth. I think you are all ahead of the curve, and thank you to Helle and team for creating a conference with the topic of degrowth. That's really nice. Cheryl, thank you for making the best primer for talking about a giant system, the current economic system. So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to just introduce you to the symbol of degrowth. It's the snail up here on the back. The snail has a shell on its back that it grows over time, and it grows and it grows, and then it stops. Because every widening ring it adds to its shell, it increases the weight of the shell by 16 times. So if the snail had just grown its house infinitely, then it would be crushed under its weight. Currently, we are in a somewhat stable climate on planet Earth. It's been lasting for 12,000 years. It's the Holocene era. It could have lasted for 50,000 more years, but something's changed. And the thing that's changed is that humanity is now the most important factor in influencing Earth's systems. It's being now referenced to as the Anthropocene era, or the Capitalocene era, because it's not all humans that has affected the planet. It's a subset of humanity and a subset of human behavior. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current growth-based economic system and what we are doing today with green growth, and how degrowth has actually grown out of the green growth thought. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of examples on how we have worked with this at 1508 and Know It Experience. So hopefully you can take some of this with you home to where you are. Right. The growth economy. One thing that all economists learn on day one at business school, and I myself is a business school student, is that there is one metric to rule them all, and it's the GDP, the gross domestic product. It is the value of all goods and services produced over a period of time. And it is actually pretty simple, because that's the only thing I'm going to dive into today from the economic sphere. So the GDP is usually applied to compare nations and countries and see which one is most prosperous and who are doing the best and which country is the best to live in and whatnot. But this does not account for a lot of factors that are more qualitative than quantitative. It is being criticized from many different angles and frontiers. The most obvious one is that it doesn't account for all the things that doesn't have a value to it. So, for example, reproduction, work, care work, and so forth. So I'm not going to dive into that any more than just saying that GDP is the metric that everyone looks to. And if we look at how has GDP been evolving over the last 60 years, we've had a positive growth in GDP every single year, apart from, of course, the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. And that gives us an average growth every year globally on the GDP for 3%. And that can sound like not a lot, 3%. But the human brain is not really good at thinking in compounding effects and exponential growth. So if we look instead of GDP in trillions of dollars, we can see that GDP has actually been doubling every 24th year, give and take. And you can see the crisis here as well in 2009 and in 2020. And this is all good if you ask the economists. This is exactly what should be happening. An ideal growth in GDP is 2 to 3%. However, one thing that economists do not really look at, and haven't been looking at for ever, actually, but they're beginning to, is the planet and the impacts that this kind of growth has on the planet. And we are now starting to have questions like, can we continue this? Because this will double every 24 years. So you can imagine how this curve will start to look more and more like this famous hockey stick. With growth comes a couple of things. One is that it drives up energy demand. So we're using more and more energy. And if you look to this curve, it's the last 60 years again. You can see the dip in 2009 and in 2020 as well. They're very closely correlated. And the same goes for material extraction. So with GDP growth comes also material extraction and energy use, something that is handled in economics as costs, that you have to pay for the energy and the material. You externalize all the environmental impacts. But if we really dive into what happens outside of economics in the real world, then we can see that we are transgressing one planetary boundary after the other. This is the planetary boundary framework from Stockholm Institute, and right now we have transgressed 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries, very close to transgressing a 7th, which is the ocean acidification limit. So again, GDP growth, 3% a year, all good from the economic point of view, but from the environmental point of view, we are transgressing one boundary after the other. And it's very important, like I said in the beginning, to look at who is actually responsible for this. Now, looking at only CO2 emissions, you can see that the global north is responsible for the vast majority. The global south, that you can see in the green box on your right-hand side, is only accountable for 80% of the CO2 emissions. So there's really a big gap between who is actually responsible for this. So what do we do with all these problems? Some forward-thinking economics, like Kate Raworth, has come up with the donut economics framework, which is basically 2 lines drawing the inner social foundation that we should not undershoot, and the outer ecological ceiling that we should not overshoot. And like Helle opened the conference telling you, Denmark, we overshoot 20 minutes past midnight on New Year's Eve. It's really bad, and be aware if someone tells you that Denmark is a very, very green front-running country, you should definitely look into that a little bit. So we have this kind of framework here that we want to use to stay within our ecological ceiling and above our social foundation. And this is a global framework, so it means that it's everyone on the planet that should be able to live within this. And what are we doing today? Today we have the green growth. And I'm introducing you to green growth because degrowth is very much the antidote to this. So what green growth states is that we can foster and continue with economic growth and development while ensuring that our natural assets continue to provide the resources and environmental services on which our well-being relies. A very mechanistic interpretation of nature, but nevertheless, this is the one definition of green growth. So basically, this is saying that we should continue growing. Technology and innovation will help us. We will save the planet by still growing. So there are a couple of points that gets criticism in this view. One is that this is, like also Helle put in the beginning of this conference, always taking a very reductionist approach. So, for example, looking only at carbon emissions or only at something else and then trying to solve the problem. But as Cheryl just told us, if we only look at a subset of a system, we will not know if we're making unintended consequences or actually have any overall impact. So, respecting that this is a very complex system that has interdependencies and tipping points that have biofeedbacks to other dimensions and so forth, if we don't acknowledge this, we will continue having tunnel vision. Secondly, it's also criticized for something that is called the myth of decoupling. And I showed you a lot of graphs before, and every time I pointed to the dip in 2009 and the dip in 2020. And that's because GDP, our economic growth, and also environmental pressures, they're very, very highly correlated. It means when economy goes up, ecological pressures goes up. The myth of decoupling says that we can actually reverse this, so that we can continue growing, everybody can get their electric vehicles and fly to Bali and where you want to go, but we can do it while also not ruining the planet. There is no empirical evidence, and trust me, scientists are looking into this day and night to try and prove whether this is true or false. Right now, there is no evidence to support that there is a viable approach in decoupling economic growth from environmental pressures. It's simply not happening on a global scale fast enough over a sustained period of time. So yeah, you can find a country, maybe Denmark, and see that they have reduced their energy to be more renewable or whatever it is. But it's not globally scalable. And therefore, because the climate is a global thing, it's not going to help us. We're not going to reach the 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming that the Paris Accord is focusing on, to give an example. The last critique of green growth is this.